and from the Ludwig von Mises Institute. That's where they all know Austrian school economics. That is economics that ain't a bunch of bull hockey. And Tom is also the author of 723 books, all of them New York Times bestsellers, by the way, too. The latest is Rollback, correct?
That's right.
Yes, and Rollback is about how you can commandeer your state government and turn it against the national government and have the former force the latter to leave you the hell alone. Right, Tom?
No, that's nullification.
Oh, no, yeah, that's nullification. What's Rollback?
Well, we talked about it before. It's basically why everything that you're told we desperately need should actually be abolished. So there's a Fed chapter, a military-industrial complex chapter, a section on the drug war, on stimulus packages. I mean, whatever it is, we're against it.
This is what to nullify. Everything.
That's right. Exactly.
Yes. Okay, very good. Okay, so you're all familiar with Tom Woods. That's why you're here. It ain't for me. You're here for him. Well, it just so happens that I have some interesting things to ask Tom about. Tom, on top of writing 700 and however many books I just made up the number of, you also wrote the introduction. Well, you're the editor of a few compendiums, all kinds of stuff, but you're the editor and the introduction writer to this great book by Murray Newton Rothbard entitled The Betrayal of the American Right. And this is the story. That's one of the things about Murray Rothbard, and there's a lot of things about Murray Rothbard, but one of them was he was an old man when he died. He lived through the whole 20th century pretty much, and he was there to tell everybody they were wrong about everything the whole time. So as you say in this introduction, this book is actually, in a sense, the closest thing that we have to an autobiography of Murray Rothbard. It's the story of the old right by way of his interactions with it, of course. And so, anyway, I was hoping maybe we could just start with you explaining to the people what is the old right, and by the way, what does it necessarily have to do with conservatism anyway?
Okay, all good questions. Somebody, some kind soul should put in the chat window a link to the book that we're talking about so people will know what we're talking about. The book is called The Betrayal of the American Right. Let's see who's the first person to get a link to that book. Well, first, before we even get into the book, what's the old right? The old right is a designation, really, that, as far as I know, Rothbard more or less probably was the first person to coin. His idea was that these were the people before National Review came along, or before 1960, let's say, the sort of anti-New Deal, anti-war, loose coalition of intellectuals and a few politicians here and there. So Howard Buffett, not Warren Buffett, Howard Buffett's father, the great congressman, would have been part of the old right. He was a non-interventionist, domestically and internationally. He was like a Ron Paul. So this is before the neoconservatives take over. It's before also the Cold War foreign policy consensus takes shape, whereby the official conservative movement says, well, for the time being, we have to have a huge military and we have to have a huge international presence to smack down the commies. So the old right, it wasn't like, there were no think tanks. I don't know, maybe the Foundation for Economic Education, but it wasn't an institutional thing. It was just a loose group of people who were just trying to fight against the growth of the welfare warfare state. And in terms of conservatism, well, it's not clear they would have called themselves conservatives, because that wasn't the attitude they had. Their attitude was, we're watching the evolution of this regime and we don't like it one bit. And there isn't a thing about it that we want to conserve. We want to uproot this thing root and branch. And so Rothbard had, for a long time, people knew he had this manuscript. And for one reason or another, obstacles always presented themselves when it came time to get it published. And then it wasn't until after his death that finally it was published. The Mises Institute had the manuscript, and they asked me to go through it and prepare it for publication and write the introduction. And as I went through it, all over the manuscript pages, Rothbard has crossed things out, he's written things in the margins. And there was one person, as I was working on this, who said, maybe you should sort of uncross out the stuff that he's crossed out, because wouldn't it be interesting to get the full story and not stuff that Rothbard wanted taken out. But I felt like we need to honor Rothbard's markings. You know, like if he wanted it cut out, I think he should have it cut out, right? I mean, like, we should honor his requests in that regard. But anyway, it's a fascinating little book because it traces the history of the old right, but it also talks about Rothbard's own participation in it, his own intellectual development, because he was not just a spectator in all this. He was a participant.
Okay, now, so here's the thing about it. If the old right is who was left outside of the New Deal consensus, then maybe we need to go back a little bit to what was it, how were things before the New Deal consensus? Because if the New Deal consensus was all of the conservatives and the liberals and the farmers and the manufacturers and black and white and everybody on board for the New Deal other than this handful of writers and crotchety old Midwestern congressmen, which, you know, small handful, then, you know, and obviously it was the Great Depression that brought about the new consensus for Roosevelt and his power and all that, such as it was anyway. But so who were these guys before that? And what part did they play in the political scheme, you know, before 29 or whatever, you know?
You know, Scott, I'm not so sure that we can even say there was anything like a conservative movement or anything even really like that, like a movement, ideological movement, other than the progressives, I think, were a self-conscious, defined movement. I don't think there really was an organized kind of resistance in the form that we see it today, or that we might have seen it in the 50s, or we saw it developing in the 1930s. There just wasn't enough of a self-conscious, philosophically rich group of people who were consistently anti-statist, or who thought there were. I mean, there were a lot of people who were against World War I, but then World War I ended, and you had basically, you know, especially by modern standards, a pretty limited federal government. So because there wasn't, I think, as much cause for alarm in the 1920s as there would be in the rest of the 20th century, it didn't seem to provoke this mass movement or even just an intellectual movement again. I mean, you know, you find isolated people here and there, but I don't think you really get anything like people coalescing around a program, an ideological, intellectual program, until the 1930s.
I see. So the conservative movement itself really is just a reactionary thing, because the liberals got so enamored of the conservative state that they made the conservatives look like libertarians, basically.
Right. Let me interrupt here because I keep getting distracted. I'm looking at the chat window and I should be talking to you, but somebody keeps asking me the same question over and over again. I think it's a little obnoxious, but somebody keeps asking me if I believe in the literal truth of the Bible. So I guess the idea is, let's trip up Tom Woods and expose him for some backwoods hick who thinks, you know, whatever. You know, look, I'm not some fundamentalist. I'm an intelligent person, and if you have acquaintance whatsoever with a biblical text knows, the Bible is a collection of books, each of which is written in a different literary genre. It's not a single book. It's a collection of books. Each one is in a different type of genre. So if I say to you, do you take a book of poetry literally? Do you take a book of history literally? Do you take, you know, all these sorts of things? This would be nonsensical. It would depend on what type of thing are you talking about. So please don't give me this, I believe in the flying spaghetti monster nonsense, because anybody who gives me this third-rate, atheistic, I'm so cool because I'm a 15-year-old atheist stuff, almost always has no idea what he's talking about, has never read any work of Thomistic philosophy. Go read Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange's book, God, His Existence and His Nature, and then you come back and tell me I'm a stupid idiot for believing in God. All right, Scott, let's get back to the conversation.
There you go. Yeah, I would recommend not feeding the trolls. I mean, if somebody has an honest question for you, that's one thing.
Yeah, and I don't mind that. Absolutely. I mean, I'm totally an open book with everybody. But I don't like this gotcha thing, or I must have an IQ of 12 because, I mean, no. You know, and have respect for each other. Like, I have respect for people in this movement, then I would expect that I would be shown the same. All right, anyway, let's get back to Rothbard, who's much cooler than all this.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so you're saying that, well, let's see, where we left off was it's after World War II that there even is a conservative movement. And at that point,
Right.
really, I think, as you say in your introduction, all the guys who were the old right, they all pretty much got old and died by then anyway. It was pretty much just
Yeah,
Rothbard that was left, and then he was stuck with Kirk and Weaver and all these guys.
exactly. Now, yeah, so Rothbard's view, like if you ask him where did the old right go, I mean, he basically says that there was a vacuum that developed because the major people politically either died or retired, and Taft died, Robert Taft, and then a lot of the intellectuals either died or retired, and then you got National Review coming along, and they were not quite so interested in publishing some of these older figures and non-interventionist figures. So it was just a sequence of events like this. But also, I think the fact is the communist menace did seem to a lot of otherwise sensible people to justify what was thought to be a temporary deviation from, limited government stuff. But, as Milton Friedman used to say, there's nothing quite so permanent as a temporary government program. And this was true of the Cold War foreign policy. I mean, temporarily we're going to have this interventionist foreign policy. Then the Soviet Union goes away, and you get like the Pat Buchanans of the world who are part of that old right tradition saying, okay, the Soviet Union is gone, now we can have a normal country again. But now people have grown so habituated to having this foreign policy, they just can't lift themselves without it. There are a lot of vested interests attached to it. It won't go away.
Yeah, well, that was even really how we got into the Cold War, according to Rothbard, was the MIC that was built up during World War II wouldn't give in.
Exactly. So the unintended consequences of these things, the way they spiral out of control. Well, this one thing, this will be a good use of the military, but then after that, we're going to keep a real eye on it. Yeah, okay, sure.
Well, and of course, the fun part, and I'm more familiar, actually. I've only ever read through little parts of this book before, The Betrayal of the American Right, but I'm more familiar with Justin Raimondo's book, Reclaiming the American Right, where he talks about how the National Review basically, again, all these old right authors were dying and retiring. William F. Buckley was left with hiring a bunch of ex-communists to be all of the founding authors of the National Review, Sidney Hook and James Burnham and Whittaker Chambers and all of these guys.
Yeah, I think even Frank Meyer was an ex-commie. I mean, Frank Meyer was a pretty good guy, except on foreign policy. And, of course, in National Review, they would publish people like Ludwig von Mises. And in the early days, Rothbard even got published there. But then it became pretty clear that you've got to toe the line on the foreign policy. And then that, then that was that. And so Rothbard then just discusses what went on after that and how really today we live in such a different world where Ron Paul opened very important doors for us. Those were all slammed in Rothbard's face. That it was not possible to be a limited government, or in his case, no government person, and be anti-war. Those were considered to be incompatible. If you really care about liberty in this country, then you got to, go get the commies. And Rothbard, of course, was about as anti-communist as you could possibly get. I don't think you could get more anti-communist than Rothbard, but his view was precisely that because I actually believe what I'm saying about communism, I believe that communism can't ultimately work, I'm sure it's going to collapse. So I don't see any need to deform our system here to go head off. I mean, for heaven's sake, if the commies want to take over Angola, this is not exactly going to produce this unbeatable empire. It's just going to drain them. I mean, let them rack up the Cambodias and the Angolas of the world and the Nicaraguas, and it's just going to hasten the end all the faster, was Rothbard's view.
Right. Well, and of course, that was how it played out, right? It was after Vietnam when the American people got the syndrome and didn't want to intervene anymore, and the Soviets did expand into Afghanistan and Angola and into South America and expanded all their commitments. All they did was hasten their demise, exactly
Right.
like he was saying. Containing them was protecting them, really.
Yeah, I mean, and also it allowed the Soviet Union to portray itself as the great champion of the oppressed colonial peoples around the world who were being unjustly put upon by the U.S. imperialists. I mean, how did that benefit the U.S.? Like the Vietnam War, the Soviet Union was able to paint the U.S. as a pro-colonial power and all this other stuff. And then after all that, after this ruining of the U.S. reputation, then the U.S. loses the war anyway, Vietnam goes communist anyway, and life just goes on, right? Like the world didn't come to an end. Life went on. And eventually, communism in Vietnam began to be undermined, from its own internal problems. So let them have their internal problems, but don't give us additional internal problems by going after theirs. I mean, so anyway, so he basically was promoting the old-timey non-interventionist view, and there was a non-interventionist, conservative, libertarian sort of view in the early 50s that didn't like how Truman went to war in Korea, that didn't like the Marshall Plan, that didn't like the Truman Doctrine, that thought that when Truman in 47 basically said that we are going to, I mean, it was basically like giving Kennedy's inaugural address 14 years early. We're going to, fight any foe and help any friend, and we're going to do this and that and the other thing. And anybody with any type of conservative sensibility would have said, this is a preposterous series of promises you're making to the world. So there was that, but it was short-lived, and as the 50s went on, you got this sort of boring, middle-of-the-road, Dwight Eisenhower kind of consensus, and we're still kind of living with the residue of that now.
All right, well, they're all mad at me for bogarting all the questions and not letting you answer, but hey, everybody, look at all the great stuff I provoked them into saying. I think this is really important, and a little bit later on, I think we got some time. So later on, I want to ask you a bit more about where the right is now and what can possibly be done for them. But I'm more than happy to turn it over to the chat audience and let them ask their questions. Tom, you are.
Well, Scott, how about this? You, why don't you be like the MC for me, and you pick out what you think would be interesting?
Yeah. Okay. That sounds fine.
And it goes really fast. Like, good luck trying to collect them all. I do this, like, once in a while, and I get through, like, 7% of the questions, and I feel terrible at the end.
So, well,
you can get like 11%.
I never have nearly this many chatters in my chat room during my radio show. I'll try to keep up here. Okay. Let's see. Let's see. Minarchism versus Anarchism. You want to talk about that?
Was the question just generically talk about that?
Yeah, which side you take, I guess.
Oh, all right. Well, I mean, I don't like the word anarchism just because the connotations of it are so stupid. Like, people think of it as a guy throwing a bomb. It's just so stupid. Or that an anarchist is against, big companies or something. Like, it's just, there's so much stupidity attached to that word. So I usually just say Rothbard, and I hope people know what it means. But I just came to the conclusion that I just can't ever imagine you could ever put this toothpaste back into the tube, that you could ever discipline the sort of people who run a government. I see no evidence of this. I don't think there's any possibility of this. Now, you could come back at me and say, okay, smarty pants, I see no evidence that a stateless society could function. Okay, touche. But having thought it through, I mean, I guess I'm of the opinion that the world doesn't just need a little reform. I feel like the world we live in is so screwed up, it needs a complete overhaul in the way that it thinks. And that's what the Rothbardian system gives you. It forces you to go back and re-examine all these ideas that you've sometimes absorbed without realizing it. These ideas that you've taken for granted. Well, certainly we need an armed gang of thugs to provide us with service A, B, and C. But wait a minute. Are you sure about that? Are you really sure about that? So anyway, I mean, this is something that I would take a long time to really delve into. But a few years ago, in fact, Scott, you might have been there. I was at Ernie Hancock's Freedom's Phoenix annual event that was in December of 2009. And he had us each get up and give like a 10-minute spiel about where we stood on the anarchist-minarchist thing. And I was so happy with how I put it. I felt like I had said it just the way I wanted to say it. And I figured, oh, eventually this will make it onto YouTube. I never saw it again. It vanished into the ether. I had 2 drinks of bourbon before I went up there, which I think helped. And they're gone. Now, I'm being interviewed by Ernie on his show tomorrow. I'm going to ask him about this. Like, would you dust off your archives and give me that video already so I can give it to these people? All right, what else, Scott? What else we got?
Yeah, I wasn't there. I was 2010. I gave my speech there.
Oh,
Frank.
were you? Okay, all right.
Okay, so no, this is an important question. I think somebody brought up, and I don't know the exact facts of this, but I'll assume the facts of the question. They said, well, what about J.P. Morgan bankrolled Ludwig von Mises? The one I'm more familiar with is that Rockefeller, David Rockefeller, sponsored Hayek.
Right. Right.
And how, and this goes in a larger bit. This is the real question: is aren't all libertarians just shills for evil corporate fascists who want no one to participate in power but themselves?
Right. Okay, well, what I'm doing right now is I got a link to where I actually talk about this exact thing on my blog, and I want people to see it because it's pretty good. So I'm going to put it in the chat window here. Hold on. Putting it in the chat window. Oh, it's not letting me copy. Hold on. Okay, what's a control V? Maybe. There we go. Bang. Oh, somebody beat me by 1 second. Okay. No, it's not J.P. Morgan. It's Rockefeller. It's so apparently Mises got a little bit of funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, and so this is proof that the powers that be want to bankroll Mises. Well, what I asked Mises' biographer Guido Holzman about this, and he said, well, okay, here are the things. He says the Rockefeller Foundation stopped funding Mises when he needed it the most, and they did not help him get a prestigious university post in the U.S. He wound up having to teach at NYU for no salary. Also, he continued to teach the same stuff that he was teaching when he was getting the money. So obviously he's not being corrupted by them. He's still teaching the same thing. So the reason that they funded him was that at the time, it's hard for us to believe this, but Mises was actually a celebrated intellectual early in the 20th century. He was already a major representative of Viennese intellectual life. And so you've got the Rockefeller Foundation. They want to have a hand in everything. They want to find out who are the big thinkers, and they want to bring them in and have some connection to them. But as time goes on, it's obvious that you're not going to be able to change Mises's mind. And obviously, Austrian economics would be the last thing in the world the financial elites of the world would want, a school of thought that would, whose implications are against all bailouts and against the central banks of the world. The financial elite went to a lot of trouble to set up the central banks of the world. You know, I mean, like, it doesn't make sense that they would want to promote Austrian economics. No, this is a LaRouche claim, and it makes absolutely zero sense. Remember, you're claiming that the most influential people in the world want to promote Austrian economics. Well, if that's the case, why is Austrian economics so obscure then? Why have they done such a rotten job? Well, of course, the answer is that they're not trying. Why would they? So this whole line of argument is preposterous because it's suggesting that the most influential people in the world can't get more professors, Austrian professors hired by universities. Like, you'd think that would be one of the easiest things they have to do. So
okay.
no.
Now, wait. Hang on now, because maybe that's a little bit of a straw man. Let me play devil's advocate for you here, Tom.
Okay.
What about the Kochs, who aren't the most influential people in the world? They are new rich. They're not the old American establishment or anything, but they are the owners. Those two brothers own, I think, the second largest or second most wealthy private company in America. They do have a tremendous amount of wealth and influence, and they have promoted and financed libertarianism and libertarians for a long time. And maybe we are just, their PR firm ultimately, this movement.
But Scott, I think that's the exception that proves the rule, because the very fact that you can name the Kochs, well, the reason you can name them is like they're the only people we can think of. Right? I mean, is there a big, long line of huge corporate benefactors of the libertarian movement? I'd love to find out who they are. Whereas to the contrary, you see huge institutional gifts being given to left-wing foundations of all sorts or to conservative groups that promote the military-industrial complex. But the very fact that we can even name the Kochs indicates how few these people are. And then the Kochs themselves. Now, I don't say the Kochs have done absolutely no good whatsoever, because I've seen some things they've funded that have actually been pretty good. On the other hand, now I may be remembering this wrong, so don't quote me on this. But Ron Paul worked for some I don't know, some kind of a free market organization that the Kochs had a hand in shortly after he left Congress the first time. And he was there for about a year, and then they canned him. And my understanding is the reason they canned him was that he took an ironclad free market position across the board, whereas their view was you have to make an exception for energy policy, because that happens to be the business we're in. Now, if that story is true and not just apocryphal, and I'd like to try and verify it, then that just proves really the point here that, well, maybe they're not really fully free market after all. Like when push comes to shove, when it's their backyard, well, maybe we're going to hem and haw a little bit. But anyway, that would be my quick answer. The fact that we even know them by name, whereas I couldn't even begin to name all the foundations that fund other stuff, suggests that we're not exactly dealing with a huge social trend.
Mm. Well, and also, I mean, I don't know all that history that well either. I'm way too young to be on any side in the Great Libertarian Civil War or anything like that. But my understanding is the two brothers, you know, their father was a Bircher, and then the two brothers that are, you know, Charles and David, they had a hardcore ideological bent for libertarianism. And basically there was a personal split between them and Rothbard and friends, etc., and all that.
Yeah,
history.
right. I mean, I mean, they
really believed in this stuff, at least, you know?
Yeah. Well, yeah, Rothbard even thanks at least one of the Kochs in the introduction to Conceived in Liberty, his book on colonial America. So they were friendly. And then, I mean, partly it was a strategic issue about, you know, should you be super hardcore? Should you be more mainstream? I think there's probably a foreign policy aspect here. There's are we promoting Austrian economics, or are we promoting just generic free market economics? You know, I mean, I have a stand on that, but this sort of thing doesn't interest me that much.
Yeah, well, and you know, especially if we're grading those kind of guys on a sliding scale or on a curve or something, they're pretty damn peaceful for conservatives. You know what I mean? That's what I think of.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to single these people, of all people that I would demonize as villains. There are a lot of people ahead of them on the list, we'll just say.
Yeah. All right, so now, let me see here. There was, if you want to talk religion, there was a question, why did you convert to Catholicism? Are you a convert, and do you want to talk about that, or you want to stick to politics?
Well, I mean, I wrote an article about this back in the 90s, but I usually don't talk about this stuff online because I just find it's never productive. Because you wind up in, I mean, if it's hard enough to argue, if it's hard enough to argue Keynes versus the Austrians productively online, then try dealing with snarky one-sentence so-called arguments on religion, and I'm ready to jump out a window, and I don't want to jump out a window, but yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe someday I'll talk about this, but for some people this is not an interesting subject, and as I say, for me, I've written about it, and I'm at peace with it, but I've just dealt with too many grumpy, hostile people on this issue, and it doesn't help people, I find. I get too worked up about it, and then I become not a good representative, and then I feel bad later, and I don't know. So when I become better behaved and better able to deal with angry critics, we can revisit this.
Okay, well, they're asking about War and Peace, and that's always first on my list anyway, so good. Let's talk about that. I want to know if the poor, pathetic, beaten, lost Republican Party could possibly find anywhere, as they're laying on the ground, they're looking around, could they possibly stumble across the idea that maybe they need to be more like Ron Paul, and then people might like them a little bit, and especially on the foreign policy issue? You think there's any hope of that?
I mean, it's not impossible, but it runs totally against their grain. Plus, even though Ron got a lot of excitement and popularity because of his stance on foreign policy, I think their view would be not enough Americans vote on foreign policy. And I actually think they're right about that. I don't think that many people vote on foreign policy, especially when you have the situation like we have now, where, yeah, there's war going on, but it seems so remote, and half-hearted, and it's not really in your face, and the U.S. casualties are relatively low, and so it's just not the make-or-break issue for people. I think the Republicans right now are thinking in terms of demographics, that with immigration, our natural voting base is being diluted, and how are we going to counter that? I think they're thinking in terms of that. I don't think they're really thinking in terms of ideas. These aren't idea people. I mean, these are people who nominated Romney, McCain, Bush, and Dole. You know, idea people don't do that. So they're not sitting around thinking, gosh, which ideas can we promote better? No, I don't know. They're thinking, how can we manipulate the rubes better next time? I think that's probably the way they're thinking.
Yeah. Well, you know, and they're really backed themselves in the corner, too, where they can't think of anything that they can tell people to convince them to like them other than, don't you hate Mexicans? And then those are the same people they're trying to win over. So that's going to be a problem, maybe.
Well, I mean, I don't know. The GOP is not by any means of one mind on immigration. That's probably one of the only issues where there is some diversity of thought among Republicans. I mean, you do have some ironclad closed borders people, but most of the Republicans are, I would say, moderate to liberal on the subject of immigration. So I think it's more the right-wing radio where you hear a lot of anger about immigration. It's not really among the elected officials. And it's funny. I mean, well, anyway. So anyway, that's what I think is going on. And I mean, they have interest groups they want to cater to, and some of these groups want the interventionist foreign policy. So, and that's not even counting, the various ways politicians benefit from supporting more government spending on the military.
Right. All right. They want to know about Rand Paul. What do you think of Rand Paul these days?
Well, nah. I hate being put on the spot. Actually, that's not true. That's not true. I love answering. I love answering. Pardon me?
Go ahead. Just
go
ahead.
All right. Well, all right. Look, Rand is the best U.S. senator we have. No, look, if people come back at me and they say, look, the fact is, whatever, the Romney endorsement aside, and, maybe the way he explains things aside, his voting record on paper is actually really very good. And if he had been an old right figure in the 50s, well, then today we would be looking back and pointing at him and saying what a model he is. I mean, he's got a much better voting record than Robert Taft. And we all like Robert Taft, so why are we holding Rand to a higher standard? That's the sort of argument. And I have to admit that when the argument is put that way, it does make me feel like maybe I'm being too hard on the guy. I mean, I just want to show you, I just want to be honest here, that I do have doubts sometimes about things that I think. It's not like I think something and then full steam ahead. That's just the way I rethink what I'm thinking. And, a lot of people whose judgment I trust tell me that, look, we know this guy well, and he's going to serve us well, and all this. But, then there's the other part of me and there's some people who will say to me, look, he's just trying to make these ideas palatable to the right-wing masses, because that's where he is, and he's got to do this. He's got to explain things in ways that will resonate with the base better than Ron Paul's message resonated with the base. And I mean, if it's just that, I have no problem with that, because I was always of the opinion that even Ron himself could, without in any way, without one iota betraying his principles, could have sometimes made the argument in ways that neocons would have had to reckon with a little bit more. And I know that's because I have the emails to prove it, because I've made some of these sorts of arguments where I don't come out and give the full-blown Rothbardian view all the time. I prepare the ground for people, and sometimes it does work. So if it's just that, I have no problem with that. But I just want to make sure that as long as the end goal is the same, I'm okay with explaining it in a way that's a little safer for people, as long as I know that's what's happening, as long as I know that's what the object is here. If that's all the object is, then I have no problem with that. But if it becomes a, when you stay in Washington any length of time, your initial idea that I'm going to change things and reform things very easily gives way to, well, but I could become more influential if I just talk down this point and talked up that point. And if I become more influential, that's better for our ideas. But then you becoming more influential becomes an end in itself. And I think everybody has to be on guard about that. And I think nobody, even people who might be inclined to support Rand Paul because he has Paul as a last name, nobody should be just automatically rushing to his support. They should be examining what he's doing and saying. And if he does something that's bad or wrong, they shouldn't say, well, all right, he's allowed 5 deviations before I get upset. He should be treated like the way we would treat Ron. If Ron was guilty of some horrible thing, we would let him have it. So anyway, so I would just say don't be unreasonable in either direction, basically.
All right, so let's see here. Intellectual property rights.
Oh, when am I going to stop getting this one? I don't know about this one. I mean, I really go back and forth on it. I am starting to think that the anti-IP people may have the stronger of the argument, but I'm still, with almost all other libertarian positions, my heart and my head are both on board. With this one, only my head's on board. So my friend Stefan Kinsella, who really is the pioneer in this, is working on a definitive treatment. I mean, he wrote a small book on this called Against Intellectual Property, but he's got what I'm sure will wind up being the definitive work, which answers some of the natural objections people might have, like, for instance, if you don't have intellectual property, no one will invent anything. If you don't have intellectual property, nobody will make movies or write books, and we would be impoverished without these things. Therefore, we need intellectual property and government protection of it in order to serve as an incentive to produce these things. He deals with all that. He shows that actually this seems plausible, but actually it's not so. So he deals with some of the kinds of complaints and suspicions that people might have when they first hear of the anti-IP position. But also then there's a theoretical argument against that, which is if you're going to say we need special government protection for this or that type of production, because without it we'll get less of that type of production, that argument would apply to all forms of production. Without a government subsidy, we'd have less spring water production. We'd have fewer books published if government didn't give subsidies to books, and so that argument would lead us to say the government should subsidize everything. So that's why I would be careful with that type of line of argument. But I would just say that this is an argument that is kind of in flux in my mind, but the direction I'm moving in is definitely in the anti-IP direction, and basically because of listening to Stefan overwhelmingly, that's the reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had a big fight with Anthony Gregory, but he finally beat me, so I ran out of arguments.
Well, the problem with Anthony Gregory is he's really smart. He's a great writer. He makes excellent arguments. Notice none of these are actually problems so far. But
right.
His real problem is he has all these talents, but he never lets up. He never shuts up, and he never lets up until one way or the other the argument is settled. Either he wins or he loses. He doesn't just say, let's just agree to disagree. He will argue with you all through dinner, and as you're walking away from the restaurant, he'll keep arguing with you. So I understand. I mean, what are you going to do other than surrender?
Yeah, he's the litmus test. That's what he is. He's a 6.5 foot green litmus test, a libertarian plumb line.
Standard bearer.
Yeah, exactly. That's what he is. All right, so this one's come up in the chat room a few times. He's asking about the origins of the Fed. Is it true that that was all a J.P. Morgan plot?
Oh, it was Morgan, Rockefeller, Kuhn, Loeb, everybody. That's the beauty of it, is that one of the things, well, when I say beauty, I mean in a sinister sense. It was one of the stories that Rothbard tells when he tells the history of the 20th century is he talks about the rivalry between the Morgans and the Rockefellers, like in the 30s.
Yeah, hey, we're going to answer about Theodore Roosevelt here, Tom, because the guy's asking also if TR, rewinding a few years before the Fed, whether TR was a Morgan stooge.
I think TR falls in the Morgan camp. Because Morgan basically bankrolled the Progressive Party when TR ran as a third party candidate in 1912. That was basically a a front for the Morgans. And of course, your textbook teaches you, well, the Progressive Party wanted to help the poor, or whatever. Yeah, okay, sure. But anyway, Rothbard tells us the history of, he shows that this rivalry between the Morgans and the Rockefellers explains a lot in U.S. history. That's what makes the case of the Fed so interesting, because here's a case where they work together. And that's how you know the Fed has to be sinister, because they're at each other's throats 99.9% of the time, but they all agree on we need an institution that can be the lender of last resort and also can inject liquidity into the system, centralize all the bank reserves in one place, and then be a source of to help provide stability for the fractional reserve system. This provides more easier lending terms for business and all these wonderful outcomes for them. So I mean, I think basically you could either do one of two things here. You could read Rothbard's little book, The Case Against the Fed, and you'll get all this. He names names and firms and who was what and who was doing what. Or you could read, you really could read the G. Edward Griffin book, the much longer book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, which I think that's a great book. I mean, some people feel like they've heard rumors this is just a conspiracy book or whatever. I don't see that. I see that as I beg your pardon?
There's very little of that in there. I mean, G. Edward Griffin is
it's
John
almost all
Bircher,
economics and just plain old verifiable history. You can just follow his footnotes.
Yeah.
But I mean, for my money, I actually think, oddly enough, I think The Case Against the Fed, even though it's a short little book, I actually think it's one of Rothbard's drier books, oddly enough. Like, you'd think the prose would just be leaping off the page. At least for me, it doesn't. I was left a little cold by that book. So I would urge people to check out either Creature from Jekyll Island, or a more interesting and meatier book by Rothbard is his neglected but very nice little textbook on banking called The Mystery of Banking.